Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. I know that what you're going to say next is going to bore everybody to tears, so get it out of the way real fast, and then I got something fascinating for the nice people who listen. But take this however you will. What's new and exciting in your world this week?
Well, I want to talk about social media because it is testing the resolve of free market types. A free market advocate would say that companies, like people, should be free to do what they want, provided they aren't imposing harm on anyone. So a free market advocate's response to Facebook and Twitter censoring posts is to walk away, find another platform, and there are many, that doesn't censor. Of course, when all your friends are on Facebook and Twitter, it makes it hard to walk away, but the platforms belong to the companies, and the company should be as free to set the rules there as you are to set the rules in your own home. Last week, Apple made it even harder for free market advocates.
Yeah, or anybody who's sensible at all.
Apple announced it will be implementing tools that will check all iPhone users' phones for child pornography. While well-intentioned, some unintended consequences are on the horizon. The way this is supposed to work is that artificial intelligence software will do the looking and then hand suspect pictures over to humans who will then determine whether to contact the authorities. But here's the thing. Worldwide, people took 1.4 trillion pictures with cell phones just last year. Globally, Apple has a 15% market share, so just do the math, and roughly that's 200 billion pictures taken by iPhones worldwide in a year. Apple software is going to have to scan 200 billion pictures each year. Apple then has to tune the software so that it flags illegal pictures but doesn't flag the legal ones. And with 200 billion pictures per year, getting that tuning anything but near to perfect is going to cause problems. For example, if Apple tunes its AI software too far in one direction, it will flag too few illegal pictures. And then people are going to start to ask why Apple is violating people's privacy if it's not catching many bad guys. But if Apple tunes the software too far in the other direction, it will flag too many legal pictures. And if it tunes the software further, the humans who do the double checking are going to be swamped with pictures, many of which the software erroneously flagged. And that means an increase in the chance that those legal pictures get sent along to the authorities. At least in the US, the authorities have an understandable tendency to react with a hair-trigger response in these matters. As a result, innocent people who are wrongly accused of such things often find themselves having to prove their innocence and sometimes finding themselves treated as guilty even after they've done so. I don't know what the right answer is here, but I do know that Apple has opened the door to what may become a very messy problem.
That's right. And the kinds of pictures that are going to be flagged are going to be embarrassing.
Oh, yes.
People who have every right and every reason to privately send a photograph to someone else now will have to understand that there is a very good chance, if you're working with an iPhone, that those photos are going to be shared. They're going to be swapped around. People will look at them. Your expectation of privacy is non-existent.
You then also get the problem, and there was an actual court case in this country maybe a year, maybe 2 years ago, where a minor took a picture of him or herself, I can't remember whether it was a male or a female, kept it on the minor's own phone, and somehow this came to light, and the person was then charged with child pornography. But it was the person's own picture of him or herself.
This is all the way back to Wickard v. Filburn. Go look up that case, because that's the crap that we're dealing with here, except electronically. And I have a lighthearted anecdote that we could probably get out of this morass with. When I was a baby, freshly minted, my mother gave me my first bath in the sink at our house. And someone, not her, took a picture of me during my first bath.
And that was common back then.
Oh, yeah, sure, of course it was. And nobody would think that was crazy or unreasonable. And they brought it down to the Photomat or wherever it was that people were getting photographs developed all the way back then. And the company printed the photograph, but cut my out of the photograph. So there's just a hole. There's just a hole where the business end of Harrigan once was. And I'm sure that's emblematic of some larger thing in my life. I don't know. I just prefer not to think about it any more than I just did. So having talked about birth, at least in some limited respect, let's talk about death. Pierce Brothers Westwood Village Memorial Park. That's a mouthful. That's the burial crypts that are so famous out in California. They have an unused crypt there that was initially purchased by the late Broadway composer Jerry Herman. Jerry decided, or his family decided, he was going to do something else. The crypt that they have is very, very close to both Marilyn Monroe and Hugh Hefner. And they have put this on the market, and for $2 million, you can spend all eternity next to Hefner and Monroe.
Huh.
Isn't that interesting?
$2 million.
Market forces even in death.
Right. There's good real estate and bad real estate, apparently.
Apparently, yes. And this crypt is good real estate. Now, I'm overcome with the feeling that I've never spent $2 million on something, I don't know, the size of a house where I live. Why would I spend $2 million on a thing that's about 8 feet long and 2.5, 3 feet wide?
Yeah.
And yet I'm absolutely certain that they're going to sell this and somebody's going to pay the sticker price on it.
Well, I'll tell you a strange thing. I enjoy taking walks in cemeteries, particularly the ones that have not the flat tombstones that are popular now because you can mow over them, but the ornate, the Gothic type ones. And here where I live, there's for want of a better term, a high-class cemetery that has several mausoleums that have got to be multi-million-dollar structures. You could live in them. They're that big.
This to me seems so ridiculous that I don't even know what to say about it, but I am equally certain that somebody's going to buy this, and they're going to be proud and happy to have done so. So, as is always the case, I rarely understand what makes certain people tick, but in the market, I don't have to care. They just go do it, and it doesn't bother me any. Sooner or later, of course, some imbecile is going to start saying, like they did just recently, well, we could have used that $2 million to feed the homeless or whatever. And I might be sympathetic to that point of view, but overriding it is the fact that people can do whatever the hell they want with their own money.
Yeah.
And I and everyone else have absolutely no right in determining what people do with their money, even in death. Which, of course, brings us to the foolishness of the week. There's a lot of competition all of a sudden. The world has gone mad again. Literally, I was asked about this 1 minute before we started recording today. What's your position on masks for school children? Because the whole country is now exploding over this.
Oh, yeah, it's coming back.
And frankly, I don't know what the right answer is. I really don't. Masks seem to work to a point, and they seem to be irritating to a point. So these people who are yelling and screaming like it's literally the most important thing in the world, I think they're all nuts. But it's the kind of thing that was going to be a pain to someone, and we probably should have a reasonable conversation about it. But look at what I just said, reasonable conversation. That never happens. I want to point our attention to, once again, the great city of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. And don't you know, that jackwagon of a mayor they've got has declared that starting September 1, all city employees will be required to be fully vaccinated if they work inside or be double masked.
Oh, wow.
What in God's green earth is that going to accomplish, for crying out loud?
Right.
You prove you're vaccinated or you have to wear 2 masks. I think they're just trying to make everything annoying.
I think they're just trying to make it so difficult that you throw up your hands and say, yeah, okay, I'll get vaccinated.
How long will it take, dare I ask, for a triple mask mandate to show up? Yeah. Because if Philadelphia does 2 masks and everybody there is sick and stupid, well, we'll do 3 and everything will be so much better. This is going to be happening all over the place.
I'm starting to see at businesses and churches and universities now signs that appear to be written to satisfy the lawyers that say something to the effect of, we strongly recommend, vaccinated or not, you wear a mask. And of course, out here in Western Pennsylvania, almost nobody wears a mask. But you could see what's happened, that they've covered themselves. So if somebody sues, they can say, look, we told everybody to wear a mask. What can we do?
We don't have that backflipping, cartwheeling thing that people do to cover themselves. We get the sign that says something like, if you're vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask, or please wear a mask if you're unvaccinated. These are the ways that it's presented here. It's always more or less a lightweight thing that's really saying, we don't care if you wear a mask or don't. Take your pick. And I think that's probably the most sensible approach. There are a bunch of people out there who refuse the vaccination. Now, I happen to think they're crazy. we'll all find out who's right in the long run, but I think they're nuts. But if that's what they want, go ahead. As long as I can get a vaccine and be roughly inoculated against all of this, I think at that point, you start to think, okay, this is not a problem anymore. You said early on that we should be thinking about this in terms of economics and externalities and things like this. And people, if they're belching out pollution of a viral form as they walk through the world, we should probably be able to exercise a claim against them. And I don't know where the dividing line is, but I know at this point, everybody who wanted a vaccination has one.
Right.
Nobody has been excluded from this. So at this point, if you don't want the vaccination and you want to walk around without a mask, I don't care. Go ahead. I think that's crazy, but go right ahead. And we'll all see what happens 3 years from now.
My university had announced that we're going to have no masks this upcoming year. And then they announced maybe a couple of weeks later that anybody who's not vaccinated has to wear a mask. And then just recently they announced for the first 2 weeks, everybody has to wear a mask because people are going to be coming on and off campus, moving students in. And okay, I understand the logic there. Lots of people who aren't part of the university community are going to be coming on and off. But at the same time that all that's happening, they're calling the faculty in for faculty meetings. When
that sounds exactly
they could do it
right.
by Zoom.
And what they're really saying is everything's going to be way too dangerous for anybody to be unmasked. And oh, by the way, you're mandated to show up these days.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Which anybody with a brain in his head and a scintilla of reason would have said, okay, that's a stupid idea. Let's move on to the next one. But look at what I said, brain college administrator. Clearly, these things don't exist in the same basket.
To get more Ant and James, buy a copy of our excellent book, Cooperation and Coercion. You can find the paper and electronic versions on Amazon and the audio version on Audible. 2 weeks ago, our episode dealt with things that people say in economics that aren't correct. And then last week, we did the same thing with government and politics, things that people frequently say about government or politics that aren't correct. The conversation was so good that we wanted to continue it in part 2 of that episode. So I have more questions for you, James, things that people say that aren't correct. And how do you respond to these? I'll give you the soft pitch first. A thing is right because the majority of people voted for it.
What could be dumber than that? Think about this one for a second. Does that mean if we get a majority on board that slavery could be okay? We don't have to have racially determined slavery. Let's go after the blue-eyed people. They make a very small percentage of the population. Clearly, they're defective, as we know from their blue eyes. They're actually a little evil and a little stupid. Let's just take their freedom away. If a majority could agree with that, does that make it acceptable?
When I hear people say this thing, I put it mentally in this category of people somehow believe that democracy has magical properties. And when I give arguments like you have given in response, often people will say, well, but a majority would never vote for that.
Total nonsense, right? And this is the idea that we've got majority rule with minority rights. If you think about it, people who make these silly claims that they should never make, it's almost always in the economics world. People say, I should get free stuff from the government. And they don't ever stop to think what that means. Because what that really means is that somebody at the point of a gun is going to have to give you what you've asked for. And I'm here to tell you there is no way to legitimize that. People do all the time. They say it's for the greater good, the public good, or God help me, the general welfare. But really, they're just looking for an after-the-fact justification for what we would all call highway robbery. And you can see how we've dipped our toes into this pool way, way too often. Because ever since the early part of the 20th century, we've been not only taking our cues from what the majority wants, but in a lot of ways and in a lot of places, telling the majority what it should want or what it should expect from government. And that gets to be a very dangerous cycle that only spins out of control. There's no way to rein it in once it's out of the bag, and it's way out of the bag right now. How do I know? People are talking still about free healthcare, free college, free income. Every time you use the word free, what you're really saying is somebody's going to have to pay a lot for this. Not me, but somebody. And these are exactly the sorts of things that the framers of the Constitution had in mind when they built the safeguards that they did. Remember, the Constitution of the United States was not supposed to be a thing that covered every minute of every day. It was supposed to set up a framework for governance that created a limited government that was extraordinarily strong in the few things it was enabled to do. And apart from that, nothing.
That leads to my next point. I wrote this down as something that I hear people say that's wrong, but the more I think about it, the more I think it's becoming true. And that is, government is a hierarchy. There's the federal government, and below that, the state governments, and below that, the local government, as if states are to the federal government what local governments are to the state government. I would say that that's the way things have evolved in the past century, but it's not the way that things were set up.
And that's a tough line to draw. The Anti-Federalists were all over the problem that was woven into that. And they said, look, if you've got the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause, and then you start working with these things, sooner or later, the federal government is going to chip away at any authority the states had managed to retain. And how is that not correct? Of course that's what happened.
In those two clauses, for people who aren't up on them, necessary and proper, Congress has the authority to make any law that's necessary and proper.
You have to read it in context, right? So when you think about this, remember, Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution lists everything that Congress is allowed to do. It's a short list. There's not a lot there. And if you read it, you'll think, wow, Congress does way more than that every day.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd be exactly right to think so. So you look at the powers that are granted to Congress, and then at the very end of that list, there's this. Okay, yeah, that's all Congress can do, but it can also do anything that is necessary and proper to bring the foregoing lists into existence. If you need to legislate in order to get one of those listed items done, and it ended up including some other power, well, okay. And who gets to decide whether the federal government has gone too far? The federal government does. We appeal this to the Supreme Court. And what do you think the federal government decides when the federal government is accused of bringing too much authority to its own plate at the expense of the states? Not surprisingly, the federal government finds in favor of the federal government almost every time.
So you mentioned two clauses, necessary and proper, that has the effect of expanding federal authority far beyond what was intended. But then the supremacy clause, which says that when federal law comes into conflict with state law, federal law automatically wins.
Yeah, that's right. And boy, the Anti-Federalists were all over this one too. They said, look, in a system like this, if you say that federal law will always trump state law when they come into dissonance, what do you think's going to happen? It's obvious what's going to happen. Congress will have absolutely no concern for rolling over states' rights. Why would they? They would for a while when the Senate was composed of senators decided by state legislatures. But with the 17th Amendment, that disappears. And all of a sudden, the Senate is not a bulwark against federal encroachment into state issues. Now it's just a big free-for-all. Well, that's exactly what we ended up with. And that one amendment actually made things worse. But things were already pretty bad in the first place.
One more on this point. State governments create local governments. So here I am in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, state government will create townships and cities and so forth. But the federal government does not create state governments. In fact, I'm thinking back to the terminology we use. When we get new states, no one ever says we created a new state. They say the state was admitted.
Yeah, and I sit here in the last of the Continental 48. Arizona was the last of the bunch to be admitted. And I was actually thinking today that we've got a bit of a residue of that. There's this newness to this place. It's not settled with the permanence of, say, Massachusetts. There's just something that's still in the water here, which makes it a little weird, and I kind of like it, actually. You know, when you think about the role the states play, it was once the case that the states were, no question about it, the primary place where most people felt the touch of politics. The federal government, this was true under the Articles of Confederation and under the Constitution, that the federal government was just this thing that took care of a couple of things that were kind of removed. You didn't really have to pay that much attention to it. In the perfect world, in the world that we framed ourselves, that's how we would look at things. But we got away from that in a very profound way. I don't think, matter of fact, I know that you won't get back to it without a calamity. Something would have to intervene that would be so terrible to get us back there that I wonder if it's ever going to happen. People don't value freedom. They value security. And as long as that's true, government will only grow.
What do you say to people who make the argument, and I'll make it with respect to the Second Amendment, but I've heard it made elsewhere, the argument that the founders, when they wrote the Second Amendment, they had no concept of modern weapons, and therefore the Second Amendment should really only apply to weaponry that was available at the time that the amendment was written?
Yeah, and I've heard that argument made before, probably hundreds, if not thousands of times. I mean, it's just pure ignorance. I could see where people like Bill Maher, these imbeciles on my TV, who think that they've latched onto something that literally no one else has ever considered in the space of the last 250 years. Think about that assertion in this way. The framers would have had no idea what freedom of the press would look like in 2021. Therefore, only newspapers that come from a physical press enjoy any sort of protection. That's idiotic, right? Everybody knows that's idiotic. You realize that we don't even use presses anymore, right? Everything's electronic. We're not setting type every morning to get the newspaper out to people. And they understand that perfectly when it's things they like, so free press, free speech, these sorts of things. But on things that the liberal elite not usually involved with, oh, dare I say it, guns, now all of a sudden different rules need to apply, and they think that they can determine the rules regardless of the sensibility of them and regardless of the constitutionality of them. I would submit that every regulation that we have put on firearms is definitionally unconstitutional. Now, I understand why we've done certain things, and even I, a Second Amendment purist, will tell you that at some point, we're going to have to rein this in. This cannot be an absolute right, because sooner or later, I'm going to have to intellectually answer the question, what do we do with nuclear warheads?
Right.
If you can afford one, can you have one? Could Elon Musk go buy 3 next week? He could probably afford them. I'm not willing to go that far. And where I tend to find myself, which is, I think, the spirit of the Second Amendment, I think the aggregate ownership of guns across the country, that has to be sufficient to make the government very nervous about doing certain things. And I know how that sounds. It sounds exactly like I want it to. Mm-hmm. That sooner or later, the people can decide, nope, we're not putting up with that, not for another minute. When you've gotten to that point, I think we're okay. So what's included? Well, clearly long arms are included because those were evident at the time. Pistols were also. So I think pistols and long arms. In the 1930s, I believe it was, we outlawed machine gun ownership. You can't have an automatic weapon. And I think when you see all these imbeciles screaming that the AR-15 is a weapon of war, they just demonstrate their stupidity here. It's not. It's absolutely not. No one ever carried an AR-15 into battle in a war. That's the civilian version of the M16, which is an automatic weapon. The AR-15 is a semi-automatic weapon, which means you have to pull the trigger every time you want a bullet to come out.
Same as you do with other legal guns.
Yeah, the vast majority of legal guns in the United States right now are semi-automatics. Mm-hmm. Revolvers aren't, but most handguns are not revolvers, and you see how this works. I think what we see here are people willfully avoiding the obvious truth. They want what they want, and they don't care what the truth is. It's unfortunate, but look, you can't be a constitutionalist and against private ownership of weapons. Now, like I said, we've gotten to machine guns, and we seem to say, okay, not that. I don't know if I agree with that or not. I probably don't. What about flamethrowers? I don't know. Should people really have flamethrowers? And I get nervous the more up the list we go. And if those are fine, what about tanks? What about cannon? All these things are very hard to deal with, and I don't know the correct answer. Handguns and long arms, trust me, I know the right answer.
Let me give you one more. Paying taxes is patriotic.
Yeah, I don't think that's right. Of course, I don't think that's right. I am endlessly irritated with people. Recently, I've been engaging in unconstructive conversations with these idiots who think that whether you wear a mask or not is the exemplar of your freedom or your slavery. Give me a break, for God's sake. It's a thin thing you put over your mouth. Federal income taxes, on the other hand, probably emblematic of freedom or slavery. When the federal government tells you, fill out this form and give us as much as we tell you you must, You really going to worry about masks? On Words and Numbers Backstage yesterday, people were pulling this crap because McDonald's said in a number of places they're going to mandate masks. And people lose their minds. Well, I'll never go to McDonald's again. Harump, harump. Give me a break. It's McDonald's, for God's sake. Don't go. Who cares? Your income taxes, on the other hand. Why are you not protesting that? A lot of people have to pay so much in every year that they could have bought a car. You want to be cranky with me about a mask?
And again, not to come across as crazy people, we're not saying that no one should pay taxes. Rather, the system that we have now, there's no upper limit.
Yeah.
Congress could, if it chose tomorrow, say we're taxing everybody 100% of their income.
Yeah, we'd all quit our jobs, but yeah.
Yeah, but the fact is there's no line in the sand that says this much the government may take and the rest of it is sacrosanct mine.
I want to go back to the actual stuff of the question that you asked, though, because there's an element here that's, I think, more important than the smaller things I've just made fun of. We have a friend, Tom Cranwitter, who lives out in Denver these days. But Tommy and I went to graduate school together, and I don't remember the occasion, but he introduced me once in front of a room, and he said, "This is my friend, James. He is the greatest patriot I know." And I thought about that a lot. It's woven into the question you just asked. Patriotism has nothing to do with your taxes. Indeed, it has nothing to do with your government. I hate the government. Why? Because I hate all government. So, by extension, of course I do. My goal is always to make it less coercive. I'll never be able to get rid of it, which is why I hate it. Now, having said that, I absolutely love the United States. This is my country. There are great people here. They live good lives, and I absolutely love it. I'm actually a patriot. I'm not a government apologist. And I think there's a gigantic difference between the two. Patriots, I love. Government apologists, I hate them as much as I hate the government.
So if you could wave a magic wand and delete government tomorrow, would you?
Yes.
And what do you do when something else rises in its place?
Oh, yeah, see, there you go. I would delete it, but what good would that be? And notice how we've just changed sides in the argument we've been having for 10 years.
Yeah.
Something at least as bad would come into its place. I guess the best we can hope to do is a refounding. And I think the odds of that are so low as to be laughable. Nonetheless, I still play that game. Everything we write, I think, is put out there in such a way that if there ever is a refounding, people can find a blueprint for it. We've done that work for you. And we'll have to see what happens down the road, because you and I have predicted that the government we have now will fall apart. And I still think that that's absolutely unavoidable. So maybe we can get back to some vision of the people instead of the government. And we'll have to see. I have no great hope for that, but at least it's possible.
And again, this is not overly crazy. Thomas Jefferson said basically the same thing. He envisioned...
It's not crazy at all. Jefferson said that the tree of liberty must be nourished with the blood of tyrants every 20 years or so.
That's not the quote I had in mind. Jefferson, in one of his letters to Madison, talked about how it would be useful if government basically was deleted every 20 years.
And they addressed this in the Federalist. That's a boneheaded thing to think for a lot of reasons, most of which have to do with continuity again. The Jeffersonian plan would take continuity out, and then you would have a constitutional convention every generation. It wasn't necessarily 20 years from it was every generation. So my children, your children, cannot be bound by decisions I made, and so on and so forth. In the Federalist, the authors will not refer to him by name as they criticize that plan. They refer to him instead as the author of the Notes on the State of Virginia.
Huh.
Thomas Jefferson had written the Declaration of Independence. Now you're going to take him out into public and say this man's crazy? Well, you can't say that, right? He wrote the Declaration of Independence, which might have been seen as crazy at the time, but became American scripture real quickly thereafter.
You said something that I've been thinking about the past couple of days, to the effect that one generation will bind another. And it occurred to me that if you look around at the various laws that impact us on your day-to-day lives, I would venture a guess that most of them are laws that no one alive had any part in enacting, whether it be the members of Congress, the president, or even voters themselves. And so we say this thing about how, well, we're a self-governing body. Yet most of the government that is imposed upon us was created by people who are no longer alive.
The government that we have, if you're looking for a metaphor, it's more like a perpetual motion machine that's in orbit, and the orbit gets wider every year. That's what we ended up with. It runs under its own power and weight, and it runs in bigger circles year in, year out. So sooner or later, and I would make the point that we passed this probably in the early 1960s, but sooner or later it will come to include literally everything, and then it will crash and flame out. And I've seen a number of people claim that the United States government was formed by the hand of God. And that's just stupid. That is not correct at all. It was written by a bunch of men in Philadelphia in 1787. That's what it was. It's not divinely inspired. Now, some of those guys were religious, to be sure. Would they have agreed on that? Well, they never talked about it, so who knows? That's an inappropriate thing to think when you're thinking about the United States government. It's made by men for men, and it ain't perfect, and its imperfections are legion, and we see them now.
Well, that's a good place to stop, James.
Yeah, I think I'm going to keep venting my spleen over on the Words and Numbers Patreon account in just a few minutes. So come on over. You can join us over there anytime you like. But apart from that, I give you the usual closing. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Be sure to join us next week.
Keep the email coming, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
We'd love to see you on the Words and Numbers Facebook group, Backstage, where the conversation continues. And if not, we'll see you here next week. And for crying out loud, be nice to each other. Until then, ladies and gentlemen, have a great week.
See you next week, James.